Did you know that I'm literate? I was a big reader when I was a kid, like reading when I was supposed to be paying attention in class, going to the library during recess, reading books in the pews at church instead of paying attention to the sermon level of reading as a kid. And then I got older and busier with school and I stopped reading for fun as much. I want to say probably from like 9th or 10th grade onward until I graduated college. Annually, I maybe read like one or two books that were not required reading, and that feels like I'm being very generous. I am fully convinced that if I went back and looked, there were probably a couple years where I didn't read anything that wasn't required reading. Summer 2022, after I graduated, I got back into reading and started reading a lot more and continued that through 2023. So I thought it might be fun to go through the books that I read this past year, tell you what I thought about them. Maybe I've read one of your favorites and we can chat in the comments, or maybe one of the books I've read will sound good and you'll read it and you'll find a new favorite. I don't know. I'm primarily an e-reader, so most of these books I don't have a physical copy of to hold up, so I'll just put like a JPEG in the corner or something. Oh, already starting this video off good with a lie. My goal was to read 20 books this year, and I would have told you I read 20 books. That's what my Goodreads says. But apparently, I logged the same book twice. So I only read 19 books. So sorry. I feel like I'm still going to take this as a win because I did read other books and graphic novels that are not logged on here, which I will discuss like halfway through this video. But I'm still going to count it as a win. Please don't take that from me. 2023 was like arguably my worst year yet. Let me have this one victory. Starting the year off, first book I finished was Nine Coaches Waiting by Mary Stewart. I think I technically started this book in December, but I didn't finish it till January, so it counts as 2023. This is the first book of this author that I had read. I really liked it. It is about a young woman who is hired on to be the governess of a boy who belongs to a wealthy family in France, and she suspects that the boy's uncle might be up to nefarious schemes to get the family fortune. And it is also a romance novel, so amongst all the like thriller mystery aspects, there is some romance between her and, you know, there's a couple of potential love interests. I really liked this book. Usually I'm not a big romance reader, and I think it's because my main gripe with it is like the romance is the story, which like that's fine if that's the kind of book that you like to read. That's just not the type that I like. I like for there to be things within the plot to worry about besides just the like will they, won't they of the relationship. I think that that makes the story more compelling in my opinion, and it keeps me interested longer. So I liked that this story was like a mystery with romance elements. Overall, a good book. Joyland by Stephen King. Stephen King is arguably my favorite author. I actually have a copy of Misery on the shelf behind me. Joyland is about a guy in his 20s in college who is feeling a little directionless in his life and isn't sure what he wants to do. So he decides to take some time to work at a theme park. Wow, I wonder why a character in their 20s who doesn't really know what they're doing, so they decide to go work at a theme park, might be really relatable for me. So yeah, arguably one of the most relatable protagonists for me personally. It doesn't just follow him at this theme park. While he's there, he finds out that there was a murder that went unsolved that was committed at the theme park decades ago, so he kind of wants to like figure out what happened. He wants to solve it. And then he also befriends a woman and her son. The son is like terminally ill, and they have like a friendship that develops. But it's very good. It's not a horror story. I know that Stephen King is heralded as like the king of horror, and I do like his horror stuff, but I actually think that his things that are not thrillers are better. I really liked Joyland. 10 out of 10 stars. I cannot recommend it enough. It isn't really scary. It's a thriller, if anything, but also just kind of a character study kind of book, I guess, but I really liked it. New favorite Stephen King book. Next up, Spare by Prince Harry. This book was okay. Sorry, Prince Harry. It was very long, I felt like. It's not physically. It's 409 pages, which is like kind of long, but I always think of the average novel as being like 300 to 350, so it's not too long. It just kind of drags a lot in the middle, especially when he starts to talk about like a lot of his military service. It feels very repetitive. Like that stuff is important to who he is as a person, and I get why so much of the book takes up that, but it just kind of dragged. I think that the beginning of the book is definitely the strongest part of it. I mean, I don't think you can really like spoil a memoir. At the beginning, it kind of talks about when Princess Diana died, and it was arguably the most emotional part of the book for me, because it's this passage where he's talking about how like he couldn't believe that she had died, so for years he believed that like she's not dead, she just had to go into hiding because of like the paparazzi and the expectations, and one day she's going to send for me and William, and we're going to be able to go see her again, and be a family. And that's just like really sad. Overall, like, it's interesting enough. If you want to read it, like, go ahead and do it. I don't know if I'd recommend it if you're like looking for a memoir to read, unless you're like really into the royal family. I do believe that the audiobook is narrated by him, because it's a memoir, so I think that he like narrated it. So I don't know, maybe if you were like listening to the audiobook in his own words, it might have been more compelling and more interesting. I'm personally not a big audiobook person, so whatever. Spare was fine. I do think that it is a fantastic title for a memoir about the second in line for the throne, considering like, you know, like that is the a very famous, you know, way to talk about heirs to a throne. Allegedly like a real quote that Prince Charles said to Princess Diana after Harry was born was like, "Oh, good job, you've given me my heir and my spare." So I think that's a phenomenal name for a memoir about this guy. Let's see. Up next, Immortality, a Love Story. This is the second book in the Anatomy duology. The first book is Anatomy, a Love Story, which is arguably one of my favorite books. I read it last year. Both by Dana Schwartz, host of Noble Blood, which is my favorite podcast, and also the teacher for a writing course that I took online this year, and I'll talk more about that later because we did a fair amount of reading in there, so I'll talk about the stuff that we read. I really liked Immortality. Immortality and Anatomy are both historical fiction, maybe historical fantasy. Like, they are fiction stories. They are very heavily rooted in like the historical period that they take place in, but there are a few fantastical elements that happen, not to give anything away. It's very good. I really liked it. I did not like it as much as I liked Anatomy, but it complements it well, and it's a good cap off to the series. I guess this is the sequel, so if I'm trying to sell it to you, I guess I will sell Anatomy to you, and then you'll just read Immortality second. It follows Hazel, who's a young woman trying to become a surgeon in the, I want to say it's like the 1860s, 1850s, during the reign of King George the Fourth. That was a train going by. So basically the first book is Hazel wanting to become a surgeon, so she hires this man who fetches bodies from graves to sell to doctors so that they can like practice surgery on. What are they called? Resurrection men. He's a resurrection man, and they kind of form a friendship and a romance, and so it kind of follows that. But at the same time, like people are going missing and then reappearing, like missing limbs and like eyes, and like something's going on, something spooky. Again, kind of like with Nine Coaches Waiting, the thing that I like about it is that it is a romance story, but it is just as much like a mystery or a thriller. Probably mystery is a better way to describe it. Like there's just as much of an emphasis on the things the characters are doing and the mystery that is unfolding as the romance that happens. Like they're given equal weight, they have equal importance. So I appreciate that. Great book. Cannot recommend Anatomy and Immortality enough. If you are kind of grossed out by like surgery being described, this probably isn't the book for you, but it is very good. Next up is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Salem's Lot follows a writer, as most Stephen King books do, who returns to his hometown of Jerusalem's Lot to work on his novel. And while he's there, weird things start happening, and spoilers, it's vampires. This is Stephen King's vampire book. I liked it. I thought it was good. I thought it was a very compelling story. I thought the characters were well written. It is pretty scary. It has some pretty scary stuff. I don't know if I would say it's Stephen King's scariest book, but you know, I always appreciate a vampire story, so I liked it. It is very like ragtag group of survivors thrown together to try and like fight this evil and save the town. And will they succeed? Will they not? What lengths are they willing to go to achieve this? What are they willing to sacrifice? So it's a good book. I recommend it. Next up, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This was my first time reading Shirley Jackson. I really liked it. I absolutely loved The Haunting of Hill House series by Mike Flanagan. I love Mike Flanagan. He is like my favorite director. My favorite thing that he's done is Midnight Mass, obviously, for, you know, obvious reasons. If you've been here and watched my videos, you can probably put together why that show would appeal to me. But I really liked The Haunting of Hill House. I didn't watch it when it came out, actually. I did not watch it until last year. If you did not know, the TV show is like not at all really similar to the book. It would probably be fairer to say that it is inspired by The Haunting of Hill House than to say it is adapted from it. But I think that's fine. I don't really care about that. And I knew that going in. So it was very interesting to read The Haunting of Hill House and see what elements from Jackson's original novel Mike Flanagan pulled to incorporate into the series, and like what elements were changed, which ones were kept, and how certain elements were interpreted and kind of twisted to have a new meaning or a new purpose in the show. I thought it was very good. The book follows a group of 4 people brought to this house, Hill House, which is supposedly haunted. Scary things go on in there, and it kind of follows them as they stay in the house for a couple of nights, and like odd things do happen, and how that affects the characters and how they interact with the environment around them and with each other. But yeah, I liked it. I thought it was good. But my favorite thing about it was, just because I do love the Mike Flanagan shows, being able to see what aspects he kind of pulled from for inspiration, and being able to be like, oh, in the show it's this. Next up, Pilgrimage to Dollywood by Helen Morales. I really wanted to like this book. I really like Dolly Parton, and I first heard of this book when I was listening to this limited podcast series in college called Dolly Parton's America. I cannot recommend that series enough if you are a fan of Dolly Parton or country music, or just kind of American culture and just like generic Americana sort of stuff. It's a fascinating series that really delves into the history of Dolly Parton as an individual, but also kind of as this larger than life figure, and examines like, why is she this kind of universally beloved character, and how did she get here? Because like statistically, Dolly Parton has like the most diverse listening audience out of like any other musician. Like, it crosses age ranges and gender and sexuality, and it crosses political lines and religious affiliations. Like, everyone loves Dolly. Why? So I first heard about this book while I was listening to that podcast because they mention it. This was like an interesting idea for a book. I really dislike the author of this book. Sorry, Helen Morales, if you are somehow watching this video. So the conceit of the book is that this woman goes on this road trip through Tennessee and visits all of these different places that are kind of like culturally relevant to Dolly Parton and country music before arriving in Dollywood, which is the Dolly Parton amusement park. I would love to go someday. It's in Pigeon Forge. So she goes to like Loretta Lynn's house, because Loretta Lynn was kind of a predecessor / contemporary, I think, of Dolly Parton. And she goes to Graceland, which is like Elvis's home. She goes to Dolly Parton's Stampede, which is like medieval times, but Dolly Parton. And she goes to Dollywood, and she goes to a few other places on the way. So it's an interesting concept, and in fact a trip that like I would love to do and write about. Like I would love to have the opportunity to go on some kind of thematic road trip and like write about it from a historical and cultural perspective. If there are any book publishers out there that want to pay me to do that, please call. So the parts of the book where she is just talking about like the history and kind of the landscape, like the parts when she's just kind of talking about Loretta Lynn or Dolly Parton or Graceland as like an institution were really fascinating. But then she's going on this road trip with her partner, who seems like less than thrilled about being there, and her daughter, who she doesn't really paint in a super flattering light. And the parts when she interjects like her own opinion about what's happening, or like anecdotes about how her husband and daughter are reacting to all of this, like I got so annoyed and bored. Like it was bad when she dared to have a thought. That was mean. When it tipped the line from being kind of like objective third person to like opinionated first person, if that makes sense. Oh, it's also important to note, like, the author, I think she has lived in America for a while, and at the time that this book was written, I think she had been in America for a while, but she is not originally American. She is from the UK. She is of Greek descent in the UK, and that like comes into play with like her perspective writing. But like the way that she kind of talks about America is it's kind of giving that meme where people make fun of the British, where like you'll be like, oh, ha ha ha, they put beans on their toast, and then someone will be like, well, at least we don't have school shootings. And it's like, dude, come on, man, like we don't want that either. Like, perspective. So that was kind of the vibe it was giving. And then also the way that she kind of talks about interactions that her daughter and partner have about her or near her, but like that she's not really a part of, really reminded me of that quote that's like, father and daughter look down on mother together. I'll like put it on the screen. So yeah, I don't know. I got a lot of whiplash with this book. Like I would be trucking along reading a part that was just like objective information with like light commentary, and I was like, yes, this is great. And then I get to a part where she's just like telling anecdotes and like talking about herself, and I'm like, God, I hate this. So like, it's okay. The book is mid, but I don't think that there's necessarily anything comparative to it on the market. Like there is not a different like travelogue Dolly Parton book that I can recommend instead. All I can recommend is that you go listen to Dolly Parton's America. Next, I do have a physical copy of this book, although I did read a digital copy. Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. For a lot of people, this is probably required reading in high school. It was not at mine. It is about a man named Charlie Gordon, and he is mentally impaired. He has a low IQ. He is what in modern times we would say is mentally disabled. That is not the noun they use to describe him in this book, because I think this book was written in the 70s. But basically, he becomes part of this experiment to try and fix that. They basically do this procedure on him that over time makes him like super smart. Like he just progressively gets smarter, and he starts out like being able to barely read and write and is very slow, and then after this procedure begins to learn and like gets to this point of like genius level intellect. It's told through the perspective of like journal entries that he's doing throughout this procedure, but it's about like he starts to become aware of the way that people treated him before and after the procedure, and he's like, I'm the same guy now that I was then, at least I think I was, but like everyone treats me differently. So it examines that and kind of like what gives a person in a society value. And it's called Flowers for Algernon because Algernon is the name of the white rat that they do the procedure on as well, and he gets super smart, so he is kind of a parallel to Charlie and his development. I loved this book. I thought it was really good. I read it super fast. I want to say I read it in like a handful of days. This copy is 300 pages. Yeah, it's like 300 pages. Standard size for a novel, but it was just really good. I just like plowed through it. So I recommend this if it was not required reading when you were in high school, and even if it was, maybe reread it. Up next, Different Seasons by Stephen King. This is a collection of 4 short stories. It is Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, Apt Pupil, The Body, and The Breathing Method. This book being here is like halfway a lie. It's a collection of 4 short stories, and I did read the first 2, Shawshank Redemption and Apt Pupil, when I was still in college, like my senior year. So I want to say I read those in like 2021, 2022, but I did not finish reading The Body, which, if you haven't heard of that one, you've probably heard of it by its movie adaptation title, which is Stand By Me, and then The Breathing Method, which like was fine. I didn't finish reading those 2 until this year. I thought this was really good. It arguably has 2 of Stephen King's most well-known short stories in it. Like, everyone knows about The Shawshank Redemption, and I would say that most people have seen Stand By Me or are like aware of it. But yeah, I liked it. With the exception of The Breathing Method, none of these stories have like fantastical elements to them. They are just stories about people. Which, like I said earlier, I think are Stephen King's best stories, are the ones where there isn't some kind of monster or cosmic entity, where like the villains are people and the struggles that the protagonists are going through are like real everyday problems, or at least like problems that you yourself might encounter or you could picture someone going through. So I thought this was really good. I think that if you're looking for a place to start with Stephen King, or if you want to read Stephen King but you're not a big fan of horror, I think that this is a great place to start because it's just 4 novellas, so that you can kind of go through them kind of quickly. You can jump around. You don't have to read all 4 if you don't want to. It is not my favorite collection of short stories by his. Currently, that is Full Dark, No Stars, but I did also really like this collection. It's arguably his most well-known. Next up is My Love, or The Peasant Girl by Rosa Guy. This book is like 150 pages, and I read it in one day. I didn't like this book. It's very sad. You are probably familiar with the musical adaptation of this book, Once on This Island, and I really like Once on This Island. I think the music is very good. I like the way that it is staged. I think that it's a phenomenal show. I think I read this in the summer because it was around the time that the live-action Little Mermaid movie came out. This story is a retelling of The Little Mermaid, or it at least is kind of inspired by The Little Mermaid. And I think that that is perhaps more prevalent in the book than in the stage show, as far as like the book has a lot more like ocean and water symbolism than maybe the musical does. I'm not sure. But I really like Once on This Island, and I think that even though it is kind of a sad musical, I think that the ending of it is very hopeful. I think that it is ultimately a story about like love and perseverance, and the ending of it is more upbeat than it is a downer. The same cannot be said of the book. The book is very sad. It has a different ending than the musical, so it is a less hopeful ending, kind of like what I said with The Haunting of Hill House. I don't even know if it's fair to say that Once on This Island is adapted from this book. I think it might be more fair to say that it's inspired by, because they do share many elements, and like the overall narrative is the same, but a lot of the details are different and arguably more fleshed out in the musical. But the fact that this story has a downer ending is probably very purposeful, so I can't complain too much. Like, I don't think that was the author trying to be mean. I think that was the author trying to make a point about this type of a narrative. I don't know. Read it if you want. Let's see. We're a little over the halfway point, so I will take a break to talk about the other things that I read this year. Starting up, I read some manga. I read the first couple volumes of Blue Exorcist. I really like the Blue Exorcist anime, and I didn't know until after I'd started reading it, but it is getting another season, I think sometime next year. The reason I started reading it is because I was like, you know what? I want to know what happens next. I want to know how this story ends. So I started reading them, and then they're like, oh, it's getting another season adapted. So I will probably still continue to read the manga, probably at least as far as has been adapted, and then maybe if it's going to be like another 3 years between, or more than that, between the next season, I'll just read ahead. I do kind of want to read more manga next year. There are a lot of shows that I start watching that only do like a couple of seasons and then they stop adapting them and I still want to know what happens. The next things, I do have physical copies, so let me grab them. And because I don't know if it's like the way that I track it or the way that Goodreads works, it doesn't really capture graphic novels as part of my shelf, but whatever. This is Claudia's story. It is a graphic novel, art and adaptation by Ashley Marie Witter. But basically, it is Interview with the Vampire, but from the perspective of Claudia, who is Louis and Lestat's daughter, and arguably my favorite character. But the artwork is very beautiful. It's all done like sepia toned, and it's just very cool. I think I tried to find the author/illustrator online to see if she has like any prints from this story or like in this art style that I could buy, and I didn't see any. Maybe I'll look again. This is very good and I've been eyeballing it for a while. So next up, also Interview with the Vampire. Did you guys know there's an Interview with the Vampire comic book series? This is from the 80s, I want to say. And it was done by Innovation Comics, which I don't think exists anymore. But they did a run of Interview with the Vampire, and then they also did The Vampire Lestat. There's a car. Thank you. And they started to do a Queen of the Damned adaptation, but allegedly the company shut down before they could get out like the last 2 copies of the series. So I don't know if those have been released as a reprint or they just don't exist. I don't know. They also did The Vampire Companion, which is kind of like a behind the scenes of the Interview with the Vampire series, or I guess the Vampire Chronicles. So the first 2 comics in this series, as well as some of the like Queen of the Damned and Vampire Companion comics, I was gifted by my dad, and these are his from the 80s. Like, he bought these in the 80s to read. My dad collects comics. He's always been a big comics guy. And he also really likes Anne Rice. Like, yeah, where do you think I get this from? Do you think this was an organic passion? No, this is something that I learned. It's learned behavior. Anyways, so he gifted me like the first 2 copies in this series, the first 2 comics. And then I have since gone through on eBay and bid on auctions and won, and I now have all 12. I mentioned earlier that I took a writing class taught by Dana Schwartz. It was a writing class on horror. So I think she mentioned it in a podcast or she tweeted about it, and I was like, oh my god, one of my favorite authors teaching a writing class on my favorite genre. I have to take this. So it was very fun. It was a little 6-week writing course through Zoom. I think it was done through like Not Sorry. And it was great. They do writing classes all the time. I know back in November they just did one on romance writing. So if you are interested in doing an online writing course, I recommend checking them out. But it was very cool. I got to meet some very cool people and connect with them through this class, and it gave me an opportunity to kind of get some of those creative writing juices going. So I loved it. Definitely one of my highlights of 2023 was that class. But we read a lot of short stories in it. We read, let's see if I can remember these off the dome. We read The Landlady by Roald Dahl, which was very spooky. His Face All Red, which I actually have a physical print of. It's written by Emily Carroll, and it's published in her collection Through the Woods, but it's also available for free online. But I do own a physical copy of His Face All Red. We read The Road Virus Heads North by Stephen King, which arguably, I think is the scariest thing I've read by Stephen King. And I'm a big Stephen King fan, but that short story, actually made my, stomach, seize up. The only other thing that he's written that's made me have, a physical reaction, in my gut, oh my god, I feel nauseous, this is so, scary and uncomfortable, was Big Driver, which is one of the stories in Full Dark, No Stars. Lacrimosa by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Sorry the lighting just got whack and I'm super washed out. It got very sunny all of a sudden. It was only a 6-week class, so obviously we didn't have a reading the first week, and then the last week we didn't have a reading. So yeah, those are the other non-novel readings that I did. Continuing on, after a short intermission, we have Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. This is the only Gillian Flynn novel I've read. Gone Girl is one of my favorite movies, so maybe I'll read Gone Girl at some point. But I loved Sharp Objects. I loved the main character, Camille, like one of the most relatable characters I've ever read. She's, at least I thought she was relatable. I thought she was very sympathetic. I really liked reading the story through her eyes, and I like her as a character. What does that say about me? Hey man. But Sharp Objects is about a woman, Camille, who is a journalist who returns to her small town to cover a missing girls case. 2 girls have gone missing within a year from this very small insular town. So she returns to report on it, and obviously is thrown back in to this community that she left, and her family that she's not close with. She kind of has a domineering mother, and she has a sister who's like kind of spoiled, and she belongs to this community, but she is now an outsider. So it's just kind of a study on that, while she's going around kind of she's not trying to necessarily solve the crime, but she's trying to get more information on it, and she's talking to like the key players in the investigation because she is a reporter. I loved it. This is also a book that I feel like I finished in a very short amount of time, like I want to say less than a week, because I just like kept reading. It was very compelling. I wanted to know what happened next. Probably one of my favorite books I've read. So can't recommend it enough if you are a fan of thriller and mystery novels. Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire. You're probably familiar with this story in musical form. Wicked. Again, like the other things I have mentioned that have been adapted into other things, the book is so different, I don't even think it is fair to call the musical an adaptation. It is inspired by. And for this one especially, like the musical takes like the broad outline of part of the novel and the characters, kind of, not even all of them, and puts them in this story, and that's that. I would say Wicked the musical is about like, it's more of like kind of a romance musical. It kind of has something to say about like society and politics. It's an entertaining musical. I like it. I've seen it twice. It's good. But the novel is very different. The novel has, the themes of the novel are like religion and spirituality and like government and politics and propaganda. Propaganda is a big theme of this story, and how, there's a car. Okay, thank you. How propaganda intertwines with themes of religion and politics, and it also kind of explores this idea of like fighting the good fight, but also like when you become disimpassioned in a movement that you felt so strongly in, like what does that do to your sense of purpose and your sense of self. It has themes of guilt, survivor's guilt, as well as kind of like how do your actions, whether you mean for them to or not, affect others, and how does that affect you? And it's a very interesting read, very sexual. It is the first book in a series of, I think, 5. I have not read the other books in this series. Quite frankly, I don't know if I will. My understanding of the way that they're written is kind of like they are in a series and they are all connected, but it's not like they follow a different character, so I think you can kind of go a while without like they almost feel like their own book, kind of self-contained. So I think that I could pick up on book 2 in a year and not be like, remind me of these characters. Like, I think it would be fine. So yeah, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was okay. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. But I thought it was an interesting read, especially since it is so different from the musical. I'm very familiar with the musical, so it wasn't even like a Hill House situation where I was like, oh, this is where we got that from, and like, oh, that's cool how that got adapted. Like, it is so different. But yeah, it was fine. Next up, second Shirley Jackson novel on this list, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This is my favorite thing by Shirley Jackson. I liked it more than The Haunting of Hill House. I liked it a lot. I would say it's like one of my favorites. I've said that about a lot of books on this list. It's very good. It is about these 2 sisters who live in this kind of like big old manor house on the outskirts of town and are outcasts from the rest of the town because a couple of years prior, their whole family died in a poisoning incident, and the town thinks that the older sister was responsible for it. And the book is told from the perspective of the younger sister, Maricat. And so in this house, it's just the two sisters and their uncle, who is an invalid following the poisoning incident. He survived, but he's like not quite there, and he's also in a wheelchair now. So it follows their lives, and then they have a cousin who comes and stays with them, and Maricat is suspicious of the cousin's intentions and like why he is there. And then there's like tension with the town people. I thought it was great. It has beautifully written prose. The way that Maricat is written as our narrator is very interesting. The way that like she interprets events versus the way that like you, the reader, kind of like read the interaction. It's got a nice mystery. It has everything going for it. I just think it's an interesting read, and I really liked it. And it's pretty short. It's only 160 pages, so you can knock this out super quick. But I really liked it. Haunting of Hill House is Shirley Jackson's most famous book. It at least has like the most famous opening line from any of her books, but I liked this one more. Up next, Agatha Christie's Poirot Investigates. I'm slowly making my way through all the Poirot books. There's like 70 of them. This is a collection of short stories all about Poirot and like the mysteries he solves. I don't know how many short stories it is. Will the description tell me? 10. It's 10 short stories. This book being in this rank in the list is kind of misleading because what I do is I always have a buffer book, which is a collection of short stories that I use as like a palate cleanser in between books. So it's what I read when I finish a book and I'm like not quite ready to jump into another book, but I still want to like read something. I will just have a collection of short stories and read 1 or 2 short stories in between. It's also good for if I haven't decided what I'm going to read next. I can just read from the short story book until I figure out the next novel I want to read. So Poirot Investigates was my short story collection that I had until I finished it. So I technically started reading it in 22 and then finished it in 23. But I liked Poirot Investigates. I like the Poirot stories. They're easy to read. They are interesting. I like trying to figure out the mystery alongside Poirot. So I think that this is good. This is the 3rd Poirot book, but honestly, I think you can read any of those books in any order, more or less. I also have a physical copy for this one, even though I read the digital copy. Life of Pi by Yann Martel. This was required reading when I was a senior in high school. I did not read it. I read most of it. I actually read more of it than I thought I had. When I was rereading it, I made it a lot further into the book before I started hitting unknown territory than I thought I would. I thought that I had only read like the first handful of chapters. I think I'd read at least like half or 2/3 of the book. I really liked this. I thought it was great. There's a reason that this is such a well-known book and it has a film adaptation. It's won all these awards. If for some reason you're not familiar with this book, Life of Pi follows a boy as him and his family are immigrating to Canada from India, and the boat that they're traveling on is hit by a storm. It's important to note the boy's father is a zookeeper. Like they owned a zoo in India, so they're transporting animals with them. And there's a big storm and it like capsizes the ship, and Pi, the narrator and protagonist of the story, makes it onto a lifeboat with a tiger, and they are trapped together at sea for like 200 days. The first chunk of the book follows him in India and his life there, and then the rest of the book is their time at sea, and then the very end is like after their time at sea. So it's very good. I thought it was fascinating and super interesting, and I always wanted to know what was happening next. And I also appreciate it as someone that currently works at a zoo. If you did not know, I currently work at a zoo in communications, and a lot of the stuff at the beginning is pro-zoo, and it kind of like talks about a lot of the things that like people critique zoos for, and it kind of like argues against them, like, no, that's not true, or like, you know, like that's not how these animals work, which I appreciated. But Life of Pi is very good. I think you should read it. All right, we're in the final section, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I really like Daphne du Maurier. I have plans to read more of her stuff. I thought that this was the first thing I had read of hers. That is not true. When I was in middle school, I read The Birds, which is one of my favorite short stories I've ever read, and that is by Daphne du Maurier. Rebecca is about a young, unnamed woman who is narrating our story, who meets this older man who owns this like large palatial estate, and they get married, and she goes to live with him there at this estate. It's called Manderley, but he is a widower, and his previous wife, Rebecca, died the year before, and so it's kind of about our narrator trying to navigate this world of like the upper crust that she is not a part of, but also trying to navigate like becoming the lady of the house in the shadow of Rebecca, who seems to her like a very well-loved and liked figure by everyone, and it's like a lot for her to live up to, and she's unsure if she is able to, and she's also kind of tormented by the head housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, who was very close to Rebecca. So it's great. It's kind of like a psychological piece. I really liked it. I thought it was very good. It had multiple plot twists that I didn't see coming, and the things that I thought were going to happen did not. So it kept me on my toes. There's a musical adaptation of this. I've not seen it. I think there's also like an opera adaptation. They made a Netflix movie of it with Lily James and Armie Hammer a couple years ago. I have not seen that, but the book cover on my digital copy was the stupid movie book cover. I hate when they do that. Kindle, give me the option to switch out movie covers. But probably more famous is the Alfred Hitchcock adaptation of Rebecca, which, no spoilers, but fun fact, because of the Hays Code, the film has a different ending than the book. I'm not going to tell you how, you just have to read the book and then watch the movie. But I really liked Rebecca. If you like mysteries, you'll like this. It's a classic. Next up is Shinto, The Kami Way by Sokyo Ono. This is a book about Shinto, which is like the folk religion of Japan. I accidentally got the emphasis of my degree to be Japanese religion and culture. I didn't plan that. The way that happened is that I took a class fall of my senior year on Japanese religion and culture because it was one of the only religion courses that was being offered in person, and I really wanted an in-person class that fall after having been online for so long, and I did minor in religious studies, so I was like, I need an in-person religion class, so I took that, and I really liked the professor, and he taught a class on Buddhism the next quarter, so I took that, and then I was looking for classes to take my last quarter just as like an elective, and someone in that class, my Buddhism class, had been like, actually his wife is also a professor here, and she teaches a class on yokai and how they fit within like the changing culture and history of Japan, and she only offers it every couple of years, and I was like, that sounds really interesting, so I took that, and now I have like 15 credits in Japanese culture. Anyways, but obviously I thought that stuff was fascinating, or else I wouldn't have kept taking classes on it. We had read excerpts from this book, I think, in some of those classes, so I was like, I should read the full book. It's a pretty old book. Yeah, it was published in the 60s, so there is probably a more recent book that could be read on the topic, but it just kind of gives a flyover of like Shinto and the practices of it, and kind of like how it fits within like Japanese life. It talks about like festivals and shrines and how all of that works. I will say, I think that if I had not like already read other texts on the subject and like taken courses on it, I think I would have had to look stuff up a lot. There were some things that as I was reading, I was like, oh yeah, I remember reading about this, and I have the background information on it, but had I not known that stuff, I think I would have had, especially at the beginning of the book, I think I would have had to have looked up a lot of things. But if you are interested in learning more about Shinto, I think that this is an okay starting spot to learn more about it. It does not delve into like the mythology of Shinto. It's more of like how it exists as an institution. But I thought it was interesting, and it's pretty short. It's 130 pages. So, final 2 books. Up next is Pet Sematary by Stephen King, which everyone is like, this is Stephen King's scariest book. It's so scary. I don't think it was that scary. I thought it was really sad. I think it's his saddest book, I'll give you that. Like, there is scary stuff that happens in it, but the main emotion that I think that this story evoked for me personally was just sad. Like, it was a very sad book. If you don't know what Pet Sematary is about, it is about this guy who is a doctor and his family that moved to a town up in Maine. And one night, while his wife and children are visiting family out of state, the household cat is hit by a car and killed. And the neighbor shows our protagonist, Dr. Louis Creed, where a pet cemetery is, that if he buries the cat, it will bring it back to life. It's an old Micmac Native American burying ground, and it does. And the themes of the book are kind of like life, like sometimes dead is better. That's kind of like the thesis of the book. And also kind of like how grief can destroy a person and destroy a family, and the way that those emotions are processed. I liked it, but again, I think it's just really sad. I think that if you go into this book expecting to have the pants scared off of you, I think that you might be disappointed. You will be sad reading this book, I can almost guarantee that. And it is also a little slow. Like, it takes a long time for like the spooky stuff to happen, which is kind of a hallmark of Stephen King's writing, but like this book especially. But I liked it. It is just under 600 pages. I think it is the longest book I read this year, but I thought it was good. It's like standard Stephen King. Like, everyone's heard of Pet Sematary. They've made multiple movie adaptations, and now they're making a TV show, so like everyone knows what this is. I thought it was good. I don't know if I would recommend it as like baby's first Stephen King, but I did enjoy it. And then finally, the last book of the year that I read, I finished this with like 3 days to spare, was Thorny Hold by Mary Stewart, who, if that name sounds familiar, it's because she wrote the first book that we read this year, which starts a trend that I want to continue, which is that I want the first book I read of the year and the last book that I read of the year to be by the same author, and I want it to be an author I haven't read before to kind of broaden my horizons. Thorny Hold is a romance novella. It's very short, it's just around 200 pages. It follows a woman who inherits a manor kind of like out in the country in England. It kind of follows her like fixing up the manor and getting to meet the neighbors and the people in the community, and also kind of trying to solve a mystery of like she's left the house by a cousin of hers, so kind of trying to like learn more about her cousin and stuff like that. And it is a romance, so obviously there's some romance in it, but like the other romance novels I have read, it is not the focal point of the book. It is like a side quest in it, which I liked. It's not really a book where a lot happens. It's more about like, it has a very simple narrative. It's a very easy read, very easy to process, very easy to read, not distressing at all. So I really liked it. I had a shit 2023, so this was like a very nice, lighthearted way to cap off the year. I thought it was very good. If you are just looking for some light reading and you want like a romance with maybe, a few potentially fantastical elements, I recommend this book. It's also the only time that I think I have read a romance novel and wanted to be the heroine. Like, usually when I read a romance novel, I feel like I read it from like an outsider's perspective. But for this one, I was like, oh my god, I want to be Galis. Like, I want to be her. I want to be the little protagonist of this story. When is it my turn? So that's high praise from me. But I liked it. It's called Thorny Hold because that is the name of the estate that she inherits. It's called Thorny Hold. But very good book. Okay, those are all the things I read this year. And this video is like 3 times as long as I thought it would be. I'm gonna have to really parse it down on editing. So however long the video ends up being, no, it was even longer when it was filmed. A lot of these books I bought digitally, but just as many of these books I read via Libby through my local library. If you don't know what Libby is, most libraries have this thing where if you have a library card, you can make a Libby account, and Libby is an online library. It lets you download e-copies of books that your library has in stock. So a lot of these books I read through the Libby app. Getting a library card is free, it costs you nothing, and it is good to support your local libraries. So if you don't have a library card, what are you doing? Go get one. Some of these books I also read via scans on the Internet Archive, which is an online library. You can make a free account. Internet Archive is like my second or third way that I'll read a book. If it's like not available on Libby, and if it's like too expensive on Kindle, I'll see if it's on the Internet Archive, because it's usually like a PDF scan, so it's just a little harder to read unless you're reading on like a monitor. But if you don't mind that, then check out the Internet Archive is a way to read books. 100% get Libby as a way to read books. Support your libraries. Literacy is important, and all of that. I'm glad to be reading again. I really missed it. I'm sure, maybe this will become an annual thing, and I'll do an annual book review. No spoilers for the books that I've already started reading in 2024. Let me know down in the comments if you had read any of these books, or if you have added any of these books to your want to read list based on my review. And let me know what your favorite book that you read in 2023 was. I'm always looking for book recommendations, so that's all I have to say about that.
Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card. Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card.
It wouldn't be a video without a guest appearance from my kitty, Akasha. What was your favorite thing you read this year? She can't read.